Well, thank you for coming out, everyone. It's great to see Ream Library full again on a beautiful day as well. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center sponsors a range of campus lectures, discussions, conferences, and conversations that foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation, as well as initiatives to foster Jewish-Christian understanding and to enhance our understanding of Catholicism from a global perspective. Today, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to collaborate once again with my economist colleagues to welcome an outstanding scholar, Professor Susan Dynarski from Harvard University. Before I introduce her, I just want to frame this event a little bit by highlighting that this talk, like a number of economics McFarland Center collaborations before this, is designed to foreground the ways that economics, particularly as it's taught and conceived here, is focused not just on generating wealth or educating students for careers in finance, though there may be a few in the audience who would like that, and that's nothing wrong with that. But we want to showcase in important ways the work that many economists do to use the tools of their discipline to address critical social challenges. Over the years, we've been fortunate to collaborate in hosting economists like healthcare reform pioneer John Gruber, Nobel Prize winner Eric Maskin, and several others who spoke to us before they won the Nobel Prize. Esther Duflo, who was recognized for her work on poverty alleviation, Bill Nordhaus, who led in integrating climate change into long-run macroeconomic analysis, and Claudia Golden, whose work on the status of women in the labor force is on the status of women in the labor force. Claudia, in fact, won the Nobel Prize about a week after she spoke here. And I may not be an economist, but I do know the difference between causation and causality. So I'm grateful, as always, to Professor Melissa Boyle, the chair of the Economics and Accounting Department, and to members of the department who have been very generous with their time and ideas in suggesting who we should invite for the series. Today's speaker, Sue Dynarski, is someone who my economist colleagues have been equally eager to welcome to campus. She's Patricia Albjerg Graham Professor of Education and a faculty research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. She's an economist whose research focuses on understanding and reducing inequality in education. She uses large-scale data sets and quantitative models of causal inference to understand the effects of charter schools, financial aid, post-secondary schooling, class size, and high school reforms on academic achievement and educational attainment. Her list of achievements is very long, including testimony before some of the most important congressional committees, consultation with key government agencies, and service to the board of editors of several distinguished and scholarly journals. Her research has garnered important awards, and I, like my colleagues, am extraordinarily grateful to her for the commitment she's brought to bringing quality data to help us think better about ethically important debates in education. So please join me in welcoming Sue Dynarski.
All right, thank you. Thanks for having me here. All the way from, my hometown is Somerville. I grew up in Somerville. And I went to Catholic schools from 1 to 12. And my Matanon was my, it's now closed, that was my high school. And big feeder school for here, as far as I know. It was a big deal to go to Holy Cross. After 12 years of Catholic school, I was like, I'm not going to a Catholic. Haven't worn plaid since 1982. Or a kilt skirt, or knee socks. So, but I can tell you about my experience. I was not well loved by the nuns in my schools. So I'm going to talk to you today, overview of some of the research and policy work that I've done on inequality in education. So I'm going to start out with sort of an overview of some data about education and inequality and who goes to college, who completes college. Some overview of what policies have been shown to be effective in closing these gaps, and then get a little bit in depth into one of my own projects that has successfully increased low-income attendance at an elite university in the Midwest, University of Michigan, where I was for 13 years. So let's go. So let's start with some facts here. So these are data on post-secondary attainment in the US organized by birth year. So this is the census data. So we got people born from 1900 out to 2000. And the top line is, do you touch college at all? You go to college, you spend a year in college and drop out. Do you go on and get a graduate degree? That's all there. And so you can see a huge growth from those born in the 20s, and I'll give you an update on these in the next slide, out to those born in 2000, where 2/3 or more of the birth cohort goes to college. This is not just high school graduates. This is everyone born in these birth cohorts, born in the US, in these birth cohorts. So pretty high enrollment rate. And then this down here is the share who get a 4-year degree, right? They get a BA from a college or a university. And that does not go up proportionally, right? So one thing to note immediately is that not everybody who goes to college gets a BA. Now, if you added on like getting a 2-year degree, that would still only add on a few percentage points here, maybe 8 percentage points. So really about half of people who go to college in the US don't get a degree. So this is very different from other countries where college's entry is tightly controlled, and you have to score very high on a set of university exams, and back it up further, you had to go to a university track in your high school, and so it's a closed channel, and the only people who get to go are those who are very likely to graduate. US is a much more open system, and people are free to go to college, and they are free to fail at it, is kind of the big thing that we see, about half actually end up with a degree. This updates those data more recently. So right around here is where the last one stopped, right? So we're up to about 68% of the birth cohort goes to college, and up to about 37%. So recently the completion rate has inched up over half. So more than half of people who go to college at this point are getting a degree. That's a recent development. And this is largely because it's leveled off up here, right, and kept climbing here. People who stopped going to college in recent years, especially around COVID, were people who were not going to get a degree, who tended not to get a degree. So those are the people who have sort of leveled off in their college going. And if anything doesn't make sense, please ask a question, because I don't want to hear in an hour, what the heck was this, right? So I'd like to know now if you need to have this interpreted in some way, right? So these are all fractions of a birth cohort that you're looking at here. So here's now some information about, that was about the levels over time, what's changed over time. There's a seat up here, if somebody wants it. So this is now about inequality, income inequality, and who goes to college in the United States. And this is based on some pretty cool data that you can download publicly, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, NLSY. And these are longitudinal data sets that follow people from when they're adolescents. They have kept going to people in their 60s. They continue to follow people over time. Why is that helpful? Because then you can link somebody's socioeconomic status in childhood to what happens to them when they're adults, right? So if you look at most data sets like this one, like census or American Community Survey, you don't know what people's circumstances were when they were growing up. You know about the current income, but you don't know who is a first gen, who came from a low-income family, who came from a high-income family. And I'm interested in how people's circumstances in their youth traces through into how they succeed in school, and how we can actually flatten that out a bit and make it more equal how people do in school, and not have it be based so much on their socioeconomic background. So longitudinal surveys let you get at this. So this is NLSY, and this is 2 cohorts. These are people who were born in the early 60s, and these are then people who were born in the late 70s, early 80s. And what we have, they're doing a new one now, but doesn't have this data yet. So we'll get there, but it's every 25 years or so, they do another. They're super expensive. And these are now sorted by your income of your family when you were like 12, 13, 14 years old. So lowest 25% of the income distribution is here. Highest 25% of the family income distribution is here. And so reading off of this, for this older cohort, 19% of kids in the lowest income quartile went to college, right? And this is the touching college at all. And this is the whole birth cohort, right? This is not just people who went to high school. This is everybody. And then it goes up, to 32 for the next quartile, and keeps going up, 58% in the top quartile. When we look at the next birth cohort, And they're born after a whole bunch of federal initiatives went through attempting to erase poverty gaps. You know, the war on poverty, the Pell Grant, student loans, whole lot of things went on, big increase in the likelihood of going to college for everybody, right? Intercept shift, the whole line shifts up. Kind of stays the same in terms of its steepness though, right? So the relationship between being low income and going to college kind of stayed about the same. It's just that everybody was going at a higher rate. At the top, up to 80% now. Right now, this is the older cohort, probably even higher now. But down the bottom, 29%. And I was down here. I'm a first gen. My dad was a mailman. He was a high school dropout, got his GED in the military. And by chance, luck, I ended up going to Harvard, going on to grad school, becoming a professor. So I'm one of the relatively rare kids down here. I'm in case you can't tell, I'm in this group. Not quite, I'm 1965, so I'm not quite in here. I am Gen X, I am not a boomer. But this is whether they graduate. And this is starkly different, right? So look at this, you know, so 19% of the kids in my little cell here went to college, 5% of them got a BA. And look, that's rocketed up to 9% for the later cohort, right? And here you now see, this looks like it's gotten steeper, right? The attendance didn't get steeper, but it looks like the completion did, which kind of matches up with that picture I showed you before, right? Where college attendance was going up, 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 but college graduation was sort of not going up nearly as fast. That not completing is concentrated in the low-income kids. Right? So that's where it's coming from. So at the top, for this cohort, 54% are ending up with a BA, right, in the top quartile, but versus 9% at the bottom. And this accords with other data that people have used to look at this question. So Raj Chetty at Harvard has looked at data from the IRS as information from tax returns about who goes to college. The income slope is about the same as what you see here in those data. So these gaps are not going away. And if you dove further into this, if you went and looked at grad school, who went to grad school, it gets even more unequal across, you know, the steepness of this gets even more severe. So what that implies, right, what I showed you, this is like, now we're actually dividing by something. This is the share of those who go to college who then get a BA, right? And you can see that, you know, down the bottom, only about a quarter to a third of the low-income students who go to college end up getting a degree in these cohorts. And this has not changed a whole lot. This has not changed much. And at the top, it's more like 2/3. Okay, so the dropout rate is much higher for low-income students. So they attend at a lower rate, but especially they drop out at a much higher rate. And we will continue to talk about this because this is kind of the part of the educational trajectory that I focus on the most in my work. All right? The gaps that I just showed you do not appear all of a sudden at high school graduation. It's not like everyone's equal before that. You know, there are huge differences in educational achievement that have emerged from starting with birth, you know, maybe not, but you know, in cognitive development, language development, verbal development, that then culminate in these gaps that we see at high school, and college. This is reading, this is the income achievement gap. So this is now, we've got test scores in, you know, elementary and middle school for kids. And they've been normalized to have, for each year, a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. There'll be a test on this in your classes tomorrow and next week. And then we calculate the difference in scores between those kids who are at the top 10% of the income distribution, take their mean test scores, kids who are in the bottom 10% of the income distribution, and calculate the gap. Right, so the bigger the gap, right, the more of a difference there is by income in test scores. This has been going up over time, right? And this is emerging well before high school. This is middle school and elementary school. So basically, any level of school that you look at, there are differences by income in people's achievement, right? So there's not one point in the pipeline where you could have a miraculous fix and make inequality, income inequality in educational attainment go away, because it really starts very early, and it's about changing the whole trajectory and the whole education system, right? Some kids, even the kids who manage, like you, to get to college, this again is about whether or not you graduate, right? So if you, this is from I wrote for the New York Times for about 8 years, and I really enjoyed being able to sort of write about things in normal language as opposed to the journals that I have to write for. And this gave me an opportunity to get ideas out to a broader audience. So this was a piece that appeared in the Times. So what we have here now is 3 socioeconomic groups, low, middle, high. Socioeconomic, when they put it this way, is like a mixture of income and your parents' education and their occupation. But I'm just gonna, for short, gonna call it high income, middle income, low income. And then you've got their test scores. Are they in the bottom quartile of the test distribution? Are they in the highest? So what do we have over here is the highest income kids with the highest test scores, right? 74% of them get a bachelor's degree. Lowest income, lowest test scores, 5%. But what I find most interesting is lowest income, highest test scores, 41% ending up with the BA versus the kids who have basically equal achievement as measured by these tests, but they have higher incomes. So now we're sort of controlling for these differences that emerge over the people's childhood, and focusing on those who actually ended up doing quite well in school, and you see big gaps by income. So it's not just about equalizing what goes on in elementary and secondary school. There's also something that happens within college. So we have some policies, and I'm going to give you a sampling of them. It is not comprehensive at all. It is my idiosyncratic pick of policies that I felt like talking about that have been shown to be effective. There's a lot of policies that are not effective. So just by picking the ones that are effective, we've winnowed it down a bit, right? And universal screening is a biggie that I think about a lot. And I wrote a piece about this. You know, a simple way to help low-income students is to make everybody take the SAT or the ACT. A dozen states do this. So you know how you all, for those of you who went to public school, you took in high school one of the state tests, right? It's required by the feds. First NCLB, No Child Left Behind, and then ESA. Both the feds required that kids in high school take at least one standardized test, right? They also take them in 3 through 8, right? Every year, 3 through 8, but at least one in high school. A dozen states have decided to make that test the SAT or the ACT instead of like the MCAS, which is the Massachusetts test, right? So you actually, you know, it's something that's useful for like, you know, applying to college and so forth. And so in these places, you take, so Michigan is the setting where I was working on this at this time. In Michigan, you take the SAT in your junior year, in your high school, during a school day, for free, and it's required, right? So basically everybody takes it. And one thing one of my doctoral students found, you know, the year they introduced this was like 2011, 2010 or so. And so you had 1 year in which it was required for everybody. And the year before that, it was just a self-selected group of students. Those who had paid for it, their parents had signed, you know, not many kids are getting on and signing on themselves, right? The parents had the credit card, they're signing it on for their kids, they're driving them on Saturday to the test taking place because it's off in the suburbs someplace, right? So there's a bunch of barriers to doing something like taking the SAT, and they correlate with people's income. So he compared what the distribution of test scores looked like when it was not mandatory and when it was mandatory, and all of a sudden, in the mandatory period, a whole bunch of low-income and Hispanic and Black kids appeared as high-scoring kids. It wasn't just like there was just economists, statisticians might think, oh, just the low-scoring people are choosing not to take the test. That was not the case. A whole bunch of kids turned up, and you could see from their scores that they were college ready, and in fact, the policy increased college going and college completion as well. So it's a pretty small thing, right? But it meant that you now had a number that sort of told you how you looked relative to other people you might be competing with for college, and got you going on the path to college in one small way. Okay? So this carries through to kindergarten through third grade. So universal screening, again, this is a case of a study that was done in Florida. I think it was Miami-Dade, but I'm not sure, where they had a gifted program, right, for kids in elementary school. And you got tested for that program if your teacher recommended that you get, and this is kind of typical. They typically don't test everybody. It's if the teacher recommends you, right? So, and guess what? Certain parents will push the teachers to recommend. It's like the SAT, right? So who gets recommended for this and who gets tested was very unequal. They decided to make it universal. Huge change in the socioeconomic makeup of the gifted classes. And the kids succeeded, the ones who had not been selected before. So basically, whenever you've got, think of any step that's required to get more intensive education, to get an application into an exam school or a private school, to get ready for college. Any of it that requires parental initiative or a teacher initiative tends to be a spot where you then see huge inequalities by income and socioeconomic status. Why? If your parents didn't go to college, they didn't learn by doing to teach you how to do the SAT and how to pick a college and all those things. So that's a big part of it. Like FAFSA. You've heard of the FAFSA, right? You filled out the FAFSA? Yes. Did you fill out the FAFSA? Your parents filled out the FAFSA, right? So the parents who went to college and did it themselves have a much easier time doing this form. That free application for federal student aid, you got to do it in order to get any financial aid in the United States. People whose parents did it are going to have an easier time getting it done than people whose parents did not. People whose parents are, say, non-English speaking immigrants who haven't been to college will have a particularly tough time getting through that kind of form, right? So these barriers make a difference. These sort of, sometimes they're called sludge, right? Administrative sludge, that you wouldn't think would make a real difference, but it does when you look at the data. On the sludge front, simplifying aid, making aid for college a more straightforward process. So a whole line of research, including my own, had shown that many quite generous financial aid programs were not having much effect on that gap that I started with. And a lot of it's about take-up. So who is actually filling out the form, who is getting the aid. So I and one of my doctoral students did some work analyzing. The FAFSA actually got shortened recently. And I get some credit for that, actually. There was based on a proposal that I made 15 years ago. It took that long to get through the process to shorten the FAFSA. What we did is we showed with the data that if you, and we had a big sample of FAFSA forms, and we could show that you could ask the 130 questions that were on the FAFSA and assign the aid as we were distributing it by income group. Or you could whittle it down to about 10, and you'd pretty much be able to get it to the same people. Why? Because if somebody's income is $15,000 a year, you don't need to ask them about their 401k, right? So some of these, basically income and a couple other things are sufficient statistics. And so we proposed a much shortened FAFSA. In fact, we proposed getting rid of the FAFSA altogether and just using IRS data to tell people proactively, you're eligible for this type of grant. It works for the tax credits. They use it that way for the tax credits. We didn't get to that, but they cut the FAFSA down to about 35 questions. That's what the meltdown was a couple of years ago, right? When the FAFSA wasn't working at all. It's because they were fixing it. The senators who led the charge on that, Bennett and who's the guy from Tennessee? He retired. He was the head of HELP for a long time. Lamar Alexander. He was a real advocate for education and for low-income students. So a very happy day was when I opened up the New York Times and there was a op-ed by these two senators citing our research and proposing this simplification. So I testified several times about how this could work, and it went from people saying impossible to it actually happening, which is the arc of most policies. So don't believe people when they say something is impossible to do. Ask them, why? What makes it impossible? Exactly what do you mean by impossible if you want to change something? All right, strengthening public colleges. Vast majority of people go to public colleges, especially low-income students. Right? So private colleges are maybe 20% of college students and smaller share of low-income students. Public colleges are the gateway to economic opportunity in our country. Right? And if they are not well-funded, then they're a poor gateway. So that completion rate that I showed you, right, the low completion rate for the low-income kids, it's mostly because they're concentrated at schools with very few resources. So you are at a relatively highly resourced institution, meaning how much is spent per student here is about 5 or 6 times what is spent on a student at a local community college. And this is like upside down compared to what we see in elementary and secondary school. So in elementary and secondary school, we see that there is more money spent per kid on the kids who are harder to educate because they are English learners, or they have a disability, or they're low income, other challenges they might have. And so more is spent on them. Completely flips when we move into post-secondary education. The amount spent on the kids at the top of the academic distribution, which happens to be often the income distribution, dwarfs what's spent on students going to the entry point, which is the community colleges. And it's been shown this matters, duh, right? So, but we had to show it, with fancy studies. It actually matters how much you spend on post-secondary education. It really affects the share of people who go on and get a degree, right? So there are many, many community colleges where 5% of those who come in manage to get a degree, right? So these numbers are really, really dispiriting. And they really indicate that we need to be fixing something. All right, so this is the part where I stop being high level and now talk about some research that I have done, in particular on this question. So this is a set of my students that I did this with. I was at the University of Michigan at the policy school at the time. And CJ was one of my MPP students. And Catherine was one of my postdocs, and Stephanie was one of my doctoral students in education. So they collaborated with me on this effort. And the story behind, I just showed you a bunch of this, so I can talk while you glance at it, but you just already saw all this information. So the admissions office and the provost at University of Michigan called me up, and they were like, we don't have many low-income kids at the University of Michigan. The statistics are quite bad. They're called the Ivy Plus. If you look at the most elite colleges in the country, the share of low-income students at these schools is minuscule, right? And they wanted to change that. So they asked me to brief them on what the research was, what the research said about how you could change this. And it went from just talking about the research to deciding to trying some stuff. And the condition of the trying some stuff was, I said, it needed to be a randomized trial so we could actually learn from what we were trying and not just muddle about. So I'll be telling you the story of that. So, I showed them this research, right, that just in general, low-income kids are far less likely to attend college, to complete college. What I haven't shown you yet, they're particularly unlikely to attend a selective school, right? So basically, the further you go up the selectivity, the competitiveness, whatever you want to call it, fewer low-income students you see. And as I showed you, and that's even true if you condition on academic preparation. I'll show you some data for Michigan on this in a second. And this matters. We have, if you talk to a labor economist 40 years ago, they might have said, well, the reason why people who go to Harvard graduate at high rates and earn a lot is because the smart people go to Harvard. And then they would politely not say the inverse. But we have very strong evidence that if you take two people who have the same academic preparation and drop one in a highly resourced institution, like Harvard or University of Michigan or Holy Cross, versus drop them into a poorly resourced institution, their outcomes will be different. It matters. Schooling quality matters. Who knew, right? Of course, it makes sense. So it actually matters where people go. And part of this gap that we see in BA attainment is coming from the sorting of students across the institutions, where even the high-achieving low-income kids who sort of beat the odds are still going to pretty low-resource schools. Okay? So here's what we were able to do in Michigan. I had been working, I moved there in 2008, spent 13 years in the Midwest, and then came back here in 21. And one thing that I did while I was there was help develop their data systems. So I worked with the state to develop a data system that follows all of the K-12 kids in the public schools from kindergarten all the way through high school, and it also matches on information about where they go to college. So we could see test scores, for that 3 through 8, and then in high school, and then we could see where they went to college. We could also see if they were eligible for free and reduced price lunch, which is a rough proxy for being in poverty in the US. So the FERPL kids, as we call them, are basically from the bottom half to bottom third of the income distribution. So what we have here is the low-income kids are blue. Maize and blue is the Michigan colors, so all of this is done in maize and blue. The low-income kids are the blue, and everyone else, kind of the upper income, upper two-thirds of the income distribution, is the yellow. And so what we have here is, and we're right here, we're looking at a set of kids who have a GPA and ACT high enough that the Michigan admissions office would consider them recruitable. They don't have a formulaic admissions system. It's a holistic, write an essay, all that stuff. But you've got to have a certain test score and grade if they're going to send stuff to your house. You're all familiar with this, right? So that's who was sort of selected for this. So this is, and to be clear, this knocks out about 80% of the low-income kids. So we're talking about the 20% of the low-income kids, maybe 30%, who made it into this category. Compare where they're going to school. Okay, so if we look at whether they go to college at all, it's a very high rate. 88% of the upper-income kids in this group are going to college. Rest are like military or taking a year off or something, a gap year. But there's even a gap here, right? 84 for the low-income kids. So there's even a gap in whether you go to college. And this is for kids who have all A's. These are all A average kids, and then quite high on the ACT. And then as you move up, so these are this Barron's categories, which are absolutely obscure. I don't really understand where they come from, but roughly, so University of Michigan Ann Arbor is in here, highly competitive or above. Harvard is over here. And the community colleges are not selective. So basically when you move from this to here, you're talking four-year schools. So this is sort of the least competitive four-year schools. Next category, next category, next category. And the gap here, and this is just kids from Michigan Public Schools, 8 percentage point gap. Right? So when we were talking, so the provost started a task force, and we started talking, and the first thing that people were saying was, well, the reason why we don't have many low-income kids is because the schools aren't training them well enough to go to University of Michigan Ann Arbor, and we need to fix the schools. Oh, that's a good agenda for a college to have, right? Those are the folks from the ed school. This was showing that actually, no, there's kids who are performing quite well, but they're not going to University of Michigan at the same rate as their upper income peers. So this is who we decided to go after with our policy. So these are the kids who were well prepared, but sometimes we call it undermatched. They weren't reaching for schools that were as selective as they could potentially get to. And this matters. So here's some data. If you're a kid in Southeast Michigan, which is where Ann Arbor is, Detroit, Flint, Lansing, you might be nearby are University of Michigan Ann Arbor, Michigan State University in Lansing, Eastern Michigan, which is kind of a regional local university. They call them directional sometimes, but they admit like 80-90% of those who apply. And then the local community college, okay? And so let's see what's different about these schools. Graduation rate at Ann Arbor is 91%. Michigan State, which is considered a pretty good school with a terrible football team, 79%. EMU, 41%. And the community college, this is actually just, do you even get an AA? 15%. So this includes either an AA or a BA, right? So huge differences in what outcomes are at these schools. Salary after attending tracks that. Very big differences in salary across the kids coming out of these schools. The cost of these schools. One oddity about the US system is that the most elite schools have the most financial aid for low-income students. So if you are a low-income student, and we took this data, this is publicly available data, but we were able to see it ourselves when we looked at the University of Michigan data. At this time, in 2014 or so, if you looked at kids from the lowest part of the income distribution, so this would be the kids eligible for the free and reduced price lunch, their out-of-pocket cost for all their college costs, that's living expenses and tuition and books, everything, they're paying $3,200. That's either basically they're doing a work-study job or they're taking a loan, because that was sort of around the max for a federal student loan at that time. If you went to Michigan State instead, that doubled to $7,000 because they have less aid at the institution. So in the United States, the federal aid is not sufficient to pay for a 4-year degree, right? The Pell Grant is not high enough to pay for a 4-year degree. It'll pay for most community colleges. But if you want a free ride, the college has to be pitching in quite a bit. And some colleges have a lot more money to pitch in than others do. University of Michigan Ann Arbor has a big endowment. Harvard has a big endowment. Eastern Michigan University does not have an endowment. Right? So $12,000 to go to the school that has much worse outcomes. You would have to go to the community college to get about the same price, but boy, do the outcomes look different. So it's consequential where you end up going to school, right? Where you go to college matters a lot in the US because we have such inequality in funding for these schools. If I could show you spending per student, and it would be magnitudes like this as well, where it's highest at the top here and lowest at the bottom. Other countries, much more equal. Norway, big surprise, right? There's much less inequality in the quality of the institutions, and students come out, and there's not big differences in their completion rates or in their earnings. All right, so what we talked about, so deciding we wanted to go after those well-prepared kids who were low income, who weren't going to the University of Michigan, how are we going to get them? We talked about the research on this. A big issue is that students face a lot of uncertainty. They don't know this number, right? They don't know that the cheapest place to go is University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. They could if they knew to look up on, the college scorecard, right? But this is pretty much most high school students don't know any of this stuff. The difference is, do their parents know it? And so when you've done surveys of sort of college knowledge of parents, which isn't done enough, you see that basically the high-income parents know this stuff and the low-income parents don't. So they're not coming after these generous packages. So lots of uncertainty. The process of financial aid in the US is very backloaded, right? So you fill out your FAFSA. You used to not be able to even start your FAFSA until January of if you're a traditional student, starting in January of your senior year. And then you had to have it done by March if you wanted to get the various scholarships. And it was a race to get your various, your income tax filed so you could have it filed and blah, blah. Advocated and got that moved back to October. But you fill out this form and you apply to colleges and you don't get a concrete offer of financial aid until after you've been admitted to one of the colleges. And they package your aid and send you an aid offer. You don't get at the start of the process, like Michigan's going to cost you this much, Michigan State's going to cost you this much. You only get that information if you applied and were admitted and then got an aid letter, which is like after you've already decided you're interested in it, they're telling you about the discount, which from a sophisticated economic standpoint is stupid, right? Why, if you're trying to encourage people to buy something, why would you wait to tell them about a big discount until they basically sign on the dotted line? Right? So it's too backloaded to affect behavior. And I already talked about the importance of support from adults. And one thing I want to make clear is that just sending students information, like why don't we just send this to everybody in the state, has no effect, right? Because it's a blur amidst all the other stuff. So it's been shown rigorously to not really do much if you just send information to people. So we designed a program which the university named the HAIL Scholarship Program, High Achieving Involved Leaders. And HAIL is the fight song at Michigan, more importantly, right? So very coded for University of Michigan. The content is what matters. So it was a commitment of 4 years of free tuition and fees. You probably know you fill out your financial aid form every year, and so your aid can change year to year. This was an upfront commitment that the tuition and fees were going to be covered for 4 years. And we sent it to people at the beginning of senior year, so when they were starting the college application process, because we wanted to affect applications. What the data had shown was that it's usually what people will think is, okay, we'll make aid more generous, and that'll help get us more low-income students. If they don't apply, they're never going to see that offer. And the problem was they weren't applying. We could see that in our data that we had put together. So we sent this commitment of 4 years of tuition and fees to those purple kids that I referred to. I showed you the graph of them, right? The low-income students with the high ACT and the high GPA, and I already told you that the college exam is universal in Michigan, right? So this is not just a self-selected set of kids who took the test. It's everybody in the high school taking the test. So we're reaching a lot more people than we would have otherwise. In fact, when we looked at so we give the university this list of students to send this stuff to. The universities all have these contact lists. They do this contact management stuff. People who signed up on the website or come to a college fair or visited the university, blah, blah, blah. Half of the students in our list were nowhere on the university's radar, right? So we were finding kids who had not been in the orbit of a place like Michigan before. And we branded it as a scholarship as opposed to financial aid, right? So we didn't say, you're poor, here's money. We said, you're awesome, here's money, right? And it's been shown this makes a difference in how people frame their own identities, right? Do you frame yourself as a scholar, or do you frame yourself as poor? And it affects behavior, how you do that. We actually said it's guaranteed. So if you get into the University of Michigan, this was guaranteed. You did not have to fill out the FAFSA or the profile, because it's not very convincing to tell somebody that this is a guarantee, but here, fill out a stack of forms this thick. Right? So we said you don't have to fill out those forms. If you do, you'll probably get more money than just tuition and fees, because remember, you get living expenses as well. And actually, these kids pretty much on average were getting a totally free ride, as you saw from the data. So we delivered a packet to the students at their home. A few weeks later, we sent a letter to their parents, and we also notified the principals in their schools who in the school was getting this offer, to try to get some reinforcement from the adults, trusted adults around them, that this was legit, that this was not some scam. This is what it looks like, right? So, and the economist did not design this. You don't want economists to design anything. Aesthetic. We're good with, the plumbing of it, but you don't want the aesthetics to be done by an economist or a plumber, right? So maize and blue, HAIL Scholarship, Victors, all this stuff, and this was personalized. This would have the name of the student on it. You open it up, and 4 years of free tuition with their name, signed by the president, tells them they're awesome, tells them it's guaranteed. No fee, no FAFSA required, no fee for the application, all this stuff. And to figure out whether this worked, because if we just sent it to everybody, we would then have year on year, we could see if it went up, applications went up, but they change for lots of reasons. Michigan wins, and then the applications go up. There's research showing this, like when you win a championship, applications and donations to your school go up. So we didn't want to rely on just time variation. And we were going to be piloting this anyway. There's 1,000 high schools in Michigan, public high schools in Michigan. So we piloted the program in half of them, okay? And piloting meant that We randomly selected half the schools, and those are the ones where we would start this process. And the other schools got rolled in later on. But that gave us an experiment. We randomly choose which schools are going to be involved, then you can compare what happens. This is the same process that's used to test vaccines and medicines and other interventions. It's the gold standard of research, and it lets you say whether something had an impact or not. So what do? We had these FERPL-eligible juniors in Michigan Public Schools who met these academic requirements that we described. And so in 2015, that was in 16, that was about 2,000 kids in each year. As I said, there's 1,000 schools in Michigan. Half of them didn't have even one high-achieving low-income student. So we were taking this set of schools and splitting them in half. And 250 of them were getting this offer, and 250 of the schools were not getting this offer. We randomized. And this is just what Michigan looks like, just so you know. And this is Southeast Michigan, right? And each of these dots, the bigger the dot, the more of these low-income, high-achieving students there are in an area. So this is Southeast. This is Ann Arbor. This is Lansing. This is Grand Rapids, another urban area. This is not very populated, but look, there's tiny little dots, right? There's tiny little dots. The typical school in our sample had like 2 of these kids in it. Many of these schools had 1. So the University of Michigan and the other schools were not going up here to have a college fair for 1 kid, right? So they were not participating in the same sort of recruitment activities that were going on down here. And what we found really is that the impact of this program was biggest, sort of the least connected these schools were to the college network. All right, we've got this thing that we're trying out. You know, what if it didn't work? We want to know whether it didn't work because it was designed poorly or because nobody actually opened the packages to read them. So first step was, did students know about Hail? Each of the packets, the personalized package, had a URL that was personalized, and if they logged in, they got a free t-shirt. So they could count up who logged in. And what we can see here is that, you know, here we are, the student letter drops in the mail, takes the mail a while, bam. People start showing up at the website to look at it. And then it tapers off, and the parent letter goes out, and bam, it goes up again. So we had some evidence that people were engaging with this material. We also, now this is creepy, but we didn't do this. The admissions office does this. They lurk at like College Confidential and the other sites where people talk about and get very anxious about their college applications. Right? So here is somebody at College Confidential, is that what it's called? You don't participate in this? Is this not any long? You do it all by TikTok? Is that how you like do your? All right, fine. It's a place where people like share information about, I got an offer, you got an offer, you know, how much does it cost, blah, blah, gossip. I received an email saying that I received mail saying that if I get into UMich, they'll provide me with a Hale scholarship, which would cover my tuition. Obviously, I'm not admitted yet, but is this a good sign? I might be accepted. I know I sound naive, but I understand colleges do these gimmicks to get schools to apply so they can lower their acceptance rate. This kid's not naive, actually, that's true. There are colleges that do this. They artificially goose their application rate so that they can have a low acceptance rate, which gets you up in those Barron's ratings that I told you about. It's a way to game the system. I got the same packet, and truth be heard, it stressed me out. I don't even think I had the capability to get through the application process. I wasn't even considering it, but of course now my parents are all gung-ho on me going. I just don't want them to get their hopes up if I'm denied. This is a theme that sociologists had seen in interviews with adolescents and their families, this sort of mutual reluctance to disappoint each other. So, you know, the kid doesn't want to apply and then not get in, or if they get in, that there's not enough aid and the parent can't afford it. And boy, the parent doesn't want to be in that situation either. And so at least in some cases, that seems to be part of what's going on. And this was putting in front of both the kid and the parent this guarantee. All right, so we do a comparison of the schools where this wasn't sent. 26% of these high-achieving low-income kids applied to the University of Michigan in these cohorts. For the schools where we sent these offers, 67% of them applied. So big increase, right, obviously, and statistically significant, right? So that's a huge increase. We didn't expect anything this large. And then they had to get in, and then they had to accept. And what you end up with is that in the control group, 12% of these kids were coming to the University of Michigan, and among those who got this offer, it was 27%. So each year, each freshman class, this is an additional 150 low-income kids. Class of 6,000, so that's like kind of a drop in the bucket, but still 150 additional low-income kids were going to a world-class university, which is pretty cool. If we compare the treatment in the control group, we can see that some of this was people who would have gone to two-year colleges, right, which is really unexpected. You know, you tend to think if somebody's sort of on the margin of going to University of Michigan Ann Arbor, which is one of the top universities in the world, their alternative is not going to a community college, but it is for a lot of people. So about a third of the 15 percentage point effect that we saw was shifting kids from two-year colleges. Remainder was from the less selective four-year colleges. And we did not, one thing that I angsted over until the data came out that let us check this, we weren't just stealing kids from like Berkeley or Virginia. In fact, we didn't do any poaching from schools as selective as University of Michigan. It did not increase, did not decrease the likelihood that students went to those schools. Only moves up. Okay? And so going back to this picture that I showed you, too excited here. Calm down. This is the picture I started with, right? Where we had the gap between the upper income and low income kids. The middle now is the kids who got the Hale offer. And the bottom is the low-income kids who didn't get the Hale offer. And you can see the Hale treatment is cutting the gaps in about half. And actually, if you go up, it's flipping the gap for places as selective as University of Michigan. So, 26% of the treatment group is going to University of Michigan. Just 20% of upper-income kids in this cohort were going to University of Michigan. So we actually flipped it. For these cohorts. And I think I should stop there so you can ask questions. I'm not going to do this part. I will just go to the part that says, thank you to the people who gave us money and data. Okay.